It was late October in Boston, the kind of gray, unsettled afternoon when the wind seemed to search for something among the streets. Leaves scraped across the cobblestones outside like dry whispers, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the air, though the sky hadn't yet decided whether to open. I had been in the library since dawn, the old McAdams branch tucked between Tremont Street and a line of narrow brick townhouses. It was one of the oldest libraries in the city, still running on its original foundation. A building that groaned in the wind, that smelled faintly of paper dust and iron pipes, that carried every decade of its age in the echo of its stairwell. My shift was almost over when I found the book. The floor was quiet, too quiet for an autumn weekday. Students usually came in around noon, drifting in with backpacks and earbuds, but the storm warnings on the radio must have kept them home. Only the reading lamps were on, their amber light glancing off the dark mahogany tables. The heating pipes rattled faintly under the floorboards. I was shelving returned materials in the history section when I saw it. A slim, cloth-bound volume that didn't belong. It sat crooked between two thick city planning directories from the 1970s. The spine dark green but unmarked. No title, no call number, no sticker, just an old linen cover that looked handmade. When I pulled it out, a small puff of dust caught the light. The fabric was rough under my fingertips, the corners frayed and soft, and the faint scent of cedar clung to it, something unlike the paper smell of the rest of the stacks. I carried it to the nearest reading table and opened it. The pages were yellowed but strong, stitched by hand. There was no title page, no publisher's mark. The handwriting inside was done in dark ink, neat, almost architectural. It began with a simple line, "Property of the Boston Department of Survey, 1826. Then below it, "Record of subterranean routes and secured chambers, for official reference only." My first thought was that it must be a replica, a prop misplaced from a local historical exhibit or perhaps a donation that hadn't been processed. But the ink was not the kind used in modern replicas. It had bled faintly into the page, a haloing of age and mineral. The pages following it were a series of maps, meticulous, hand-drawn sketches of Boston streets, but older, before the landfill expansion, before the Back Bay was filled in. The outlines were different, the shoreline curling closer toward the common. Beneath the street names were faint dotted lines marked with numbers and annotations. Tunnel A, Section D, secured. Entry concealed by utility grate, corner of Beacon and Spruce. The sound of the wind brushed the windows. I sat there for a while, turning pages slowly. It wasn't only tunnels. There were entries, handwritten notes by what seemed to be multiple surveyors. They described sealed rooms beneath old churches, drainage paths rerouted under government buildings, forgotten culverts leading into what had once been private cellars. Some of the notes had been added later in pencil, their handwriting slanted and uncertain. "Do not reopen. Collapse in 1843. 2 men missing. Chamber under Tremont, possible link to early firebreak design." Each page felt heavier as I turned it, as though the book had its own quiet pulse. I told myself it was nothing extraordinary, just an archival copy of city infrastructure studies. Boston was riddled with tunnels, from the old sewage systems to abandoned train routes. But something about the way the book was hidden, slipped into a random section with no record, unsettled me. I checked the inside of the back cover. There, faintly penciled in small cursive, was a date, filed 1922 MC. I decided to log it into the system before leaving for the night. Downstairs, the circulation desk light flickered as I switched it on. The building's power always stuttered before a storm. I placed the book on the scanner, but when I tried to read the barcode, there was none. When I ran the digital lookup, it returned no result. "Uncatalogued item," the terminal said in its dull blue glow. That, in itself, wasn't too unusual. Donations came in every month, sometimes unsorted. But something made me hesitate before writing it down as such. I couldn't shake the faint unease that came from how the book had waited. Just barely visible, half hidden in the wrong section, as though someone had wanted it to be found, but not easily. Outside, thunder cracked low across the bay. I decided to lock it in the reference desk cabinet overnight and go home early. But when I reached for the key, I noticed the old rotary phone on the wall ringing softly. The internal line. No one used it anymore. The newer staff preferred the intercom or their cell phones. The ring was slow, deliberate, like something patient and mechanical from another decade. I lifted the receiver. "McAdams Library," I said automatically. Silence. Then a faint sound, not static, but like wind moving through a long metal tunnel. A second later, the line went dead. I stood there, the receiver cold in my hand. The thunder rolled again, closer this time. I locked the doors, turned off the main lights, and decided to leave. But as I passed the upper mezzanine, I noticed something that made me stop. One of the glass cases near the Colonial Archives display was open. The latch hung loosely. Inside, a gap where a map had been displayed, a reproduction of an 1820 city plan. Gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I live in a small apartment near South End, a top-floor walk-up that looks out toward a cluster of sycamores. The rain started after midnight, soft at first, then hard against the windows. I lay awake listening to the pipes hum and the faint metallic rattle of the wind through the vent. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that book's diagrams, the faint dotted lines beneath the city, the strange warnings scribbled in pencil. By morning, I decided to check the archives at City Hall. The clerk on duty, an older man named Harris, had been working there longer than anyone I knew. He was one of those men who kept everything orderly but didn't talk unless necessary. I asked him if there had ever been records of subterranean mapping from the 1820s. He frowned, rubbing his chin. Plenty of mapping, sure, but most were coastal surveys. Anything underground came later, late 19th century. Sewer commissions and such. Why? I told him I'd found something that might belong to the city's historical collections. He shrugged, uninterested. If it was official, it'd be stamped with a departmental seal. "You said it's handwritten?" "Yes." He leaned forward. "Be careful with that. If it's real, it might not have been meant for circulation. Some of those early urban planning notes, let's just say they documented things people didn't want public." I asked what kind of things. Private tunnels, emergency shelters, smugglers' paths. Boston was full of them. Some connected basements of taverns to the docks. During Prohibition, they were used for more than storing whiskey. He paused. "If you've got something from that period, the Historical Society might want to see it. But you didn't hear that from me." I thanked him and left. By afternoon, the storm had passed. The air was cold, washed clean. I walked back to the library with a strange tightness in my chest. Curiosity and unease in equal measure. When I unlocked the reference desk cabinet, the book was still there, exactly where I'd left it. That evening, I began reading again, slowly, page by page. Near the middle of the book, I found an entry labeled Chamber 7, South End vicinity. The map sketch matched streets I knew: Tremont, Shawmut, Union Park. But there was an annotation beneath it. Substructure reinforced with brick. Access via trap within former almshouse cellar. Sealed 1842. Possible civic utility use restricted. The description struck me. I remembered reading about the old almshouse demolished during the fire reforms in the 1850s. Its foundation was never redeveloped because the ground had shifted. The site was now part of a small community park less than 3 blocks from my apartment. I don't know why I decided to go there. Curiosity, I told myself, or maybe the small, irrational sense that I was meant to verify what I'd read. At dusk, I walked there with a flashlight and gloves in my coat pocket. The park was quiet, bordered by short iron fences and oaks shedding their leaves. A narrow brick path ran through the middle, damp from the earlier rain. The smell of wet earth and iron hung in the air. Near the northern edge stood a small utility shed, locked, but old. The foundation stones beneath it were older than the structure itself, mismatched granite that seemed salvaged. I knelt and ran my fingers along the cracks. The soil was soft, and just visible under the corner of one slab was a square outline of rusted iron. A hatch, maybe 2 feet wide, half buried. I hesitated. The sensible part of me said to stop, to report it, to let history remain where it lay. But another part, the same part that had led me into library work, that need to uncover, to understand, wouldn't let go. I brushed away the soil until the edge of the hatch was clear. The metal was corroded, but a faint groove suggested a handle had once been there. Using a screwdriver from my keychain tool, I pried gently. The hatch lifted with a deep metallic groan, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled like limestone and old dust. A narrow shaft descended into darkness, brick-lined and dry. A corroded iron ladder led down maybe 15 feet. I shone my flashlight in. The beam caught the curve of a tunnel heading north. I climbed down. The air grew colder immediately, dry and still. The tunnel was wide enough to stand upright, arched overhead with bricks mottled in gray. My footsteps echoed faintly. Along the walls, mineral streaks glistened where moisture had seeped through. I walked slowly, counting paces, marking each corner in my memory in case I needed to return quickly. About 40 feet in, the tunnel widened into a small chamber, roughly circular, with a low ceiling. Debris littered the floor. Old wooden planks, a rusted tin can, what might have been fragments of ceramic. But near the far wall, something caught the light. A small metal plaque, tarnished but legible. Chamber 7, Boston Department of Survey, 1826. The same year as the book. I stepped closer. Beneath the plaque, set into the wall, was a sealed metal door. No handle, just a riveted plate. I traced the edge with my fingers. The metal was cold, slick with condensation. The door hummed faintly under my touch, as if it carried a low vibration. I leaned in, listening, but heard only my own breathing. I stayed there longer than I should have, trying to understand what it meant. Why a chamber like this existed beneath a public park, why it was recorded in a book hidden in a library shelf, and why that book had surfaced now. When I finally climbed out, the air above ground felt shockingly fresh, like surfacing from underwater. The sky had darkened to a soft navy, the streetlights flickering on. I walked home without looking back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the humming. It hadn't been mechanical. It had been too steady, too deep, like the resonance of the earth itself. Over the next week, I began noticing small things. A man in a brown coat standing near the library steps 2 mornings in a row, smoking but never entering. A faint change in the library's main hallway. The smell of damp stone, subtle but distinct, as though something underground had been disturbed. Once, late at night while closing up, I thought I heard faint scraping from beneath the floorboards near the archives room. I told myself it was plumbing. Old buildings made noises. But when I returned to the book the next day, one of the maps was missing, torn cleanly out. I went cold. The rest of the book was untouched, but that single page, the map of Chamber 7, was gone. I checked the surveillance cameras. The system was outdated, grainy, but one recording from the previous evening showed movement. A shadow near the shelves, just after closing, faintly human but indistinct. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed at my desk until dawn, rereading every remaining page. Toward the end of the book, in smaller handwriting, was a final annotation. No date, no signature. Records withheld under municipal directive. Access granted to authorized personnel only. Breach subject to removal. Removal. The word lingered in my head like an echo. I realized I couldn't keep the book there anymore. I wrapped it in cloth, took it home, and hid it behind the insulation panel beneath my bedroom window. The next morning, I went to work as usual. Everything looked normal. The man in the brown coat wasn't there. The day passed in routine, shelving, cataloging, silence. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Then, just before closing, the phone rang again. The old rotary one on the wall. I picked it up. This time, a voice. Low, even almost kind. "You shouldn't have gone down there." I said nothing. "The book belongs to the city," the voice continued. "Return it, and nothing further will happen." The line went dead. That evening, I went to the police. I told them about the phone calls, the strange book, the missing page. They took notes politely but without conviction. The officer suggested I lock the library more carefully and avoid late shifts alone. When I returned home, my apartment door was ajar. Nothing was taken, not visibly, but when I checked the panel under the window, the book was gone. For a long time, I just stood there. Outside, the city moved on, the traffic, the muffled horns, the faint clang of the green line. Life indifferent as ever. Days turned to weeks. The library resumed its quiet rhythm. No more phone calls. No more shadows. Sometimes, when I closed the last door at night, I still felt the hum beneath the floor, like something far below still turning. Months later, while cleaning the archives room for a scheduled renovation, I found a folded slip of paper wedged behind the filing cabinet. It was old, the paper yellowed. On it was a single line written in the same inked hand as the book. Some histories stay buried not because they are forgotten, but because they still move. I read it several times before tucking it into my pocket. I've often wondered what was behind that door under the park. Whether it was simply a relic, a piece of infrastructure lost to time, or something else the city had chosen to seal away. Whatever it was, the city above has continued, layer upon layer, unaware or pretending to be. When I walk home now, I take the long route, past the park, past the narrow alleys that smell of wet brick and rusted iron. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind slides down from the harbor, I feel a faint vibration through the pavement. Rhythmic, steady, almost like a pulse. I tell myself it's the trains. But when I stop and listen, there's a pattern to it. 3 slow beats, a pause, then 2 more. It reminds me of a heartbeat. Old, patient, waiting. And though I've learned not to speak of it, I know what I heard that night beneath the ground wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of the city remembering. The first night it happened, the air was so clear I could see the sweep of the Milky Way spilling across the water like frost. Early September along the Maine coast is a strange balance. Summer heat fading, but not yet gone. Nights sharp and thin, filled with the smell of salt and pine. I had been at the Lighthouse for 7 months then, stationed alone on a narrow finger of rock that jutted into the Atlantic like a half-closed fist. My nearest neighbors were 10 miles inland, and the only connection to the mainland was a supply boat that came twice a week, if the weather held. The tower itself was old, built in 1883, whitewashed stone that cracked like old teeth in the wind. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of salt and kerosene, no matter how much I scrubbed. The light mechanism, a refurbished Fresnel lens, turned with a steady mechanical heartbeat every 12 seconds. The sound of it was my company most nights. The steady grind of gears, the whisper of the sea, and the wind brushing against the glass like fingertips. That it was just past midnight, and the tide was at its lowest, the rocks below the tower glistening black and slick with weed. I was making my rounds, checking the fuel lines and the foghorn compressor, when I noticed it, 3 short flashes from the dark horizon. Then a pause. Then 2 more. I stopped at the window, my breath misting the glass. The flashes came from somewhere beyond the shoals. Too distant to be a buoy, too precise to be lightning. They came again in the same rhythm, 3 short, pause, too long. My first thought was Morse code. So incomplete, like the beginning of an SOS. But it stopped there, hanging unfinished in the dark. At first, I thought maybe it was a reflection, some trick of the rotating lens catching moisture in the air. But the beam was steady, and the flashes were offbeat, as though answering the lighthouse. I waited another minute, then again 3 short, too long. Something inside me went cold, not fear exactly, but the kind of awareness that grips the stomach and refuses to let go. I jotted the time in my logbook, 12:14 a.m., intermittent light flashes east-northeast, duration 7 seconds, possible distress signal. The protocol was to radio the Coast Guard station in Rockland. I picked up the transmitter, but the static on the line was heavy. After a few attempts, I gave up and noted it for morning. The night stretched quiet again, the sea calm, only the faint lapping of water against the rock. By dawn, the horizon was empty. The next night, the signal returned. This time it came earlier, just after 10 p.m., when the moon was bright and low, tinting the water the color of pewter. 3 short, too long. Over and over. I climbed to the top of the tower and swept the horizon with binoculars. Nothing but black water and a faint shimmer of whitecaps. No running lights, no silhouette. The radio crackled faintly, but there was no voice. The morning after, I reported the sightings in the log and phoned the Coast Guard when the signal cleared. They told me no distress calls had been received, no ships were overdue, and no vessels were scheduled along my stretch of coast that night. The officer on duty suggested I might be seeing light reflections from distant lobster boats or even aircraft beacons. I didn't argue. But I knew the pattern. It was too regular, too deliberate. The next few nights were quiet. The sea flattened under high pressure, the days warm and bright. I spent my hours maintaining the tower, polishing brass fittings, cleaning the lens, sealing cracks in the stone with new mortar. The silence of the island had a rhythm to it. Waves slapping the rocks, gulls crying overhead, the soft hiss of wind moving through the fir trees on the inland ridge. I had learned to measure time not by hours, but by light, by how the sun hit the water, by how the air smelled just before rain. But 5 nights later, the signal came again. I saw it just after the fog rolled in thick, heavy mist that moved across the water like breath. Visibility was down to 20 yards. The foghorn moaned every 30 seconds, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through my ribs. I had stepped outside to adjust the weather vane when I saw the glow. A diffuse, pulsing light through the fog, 3 short, pause, too long. It wasn't a reflection. It came from the sea itself. I waited, squinting into the mist, trying to make out a shape. But there was nothing, only that rhythm, again and again, until the fog thickened so much it swallowed everything whole. When I returned inside, I noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped abruptly. My breath clouded the air, though the thermometer still read 54 degrees. The light from the lens flickered slightly, once, then steadied. I logged the sighting again, hands shaking just enough to smudge the INK at dawn. The fog thinned, revealing the sea calm and empty. But along the rocks at the base of the lighthouse, I found something strange. A piece of wood, about 2 feet long, splintered at one end. It looked like part of a hull or oar, painted dark green with gold trim. I carried it up to the keeper's quarters and leaned it against the wall. The paint was old, flaking, but not rotten. I couldn't place its origin. Later that week, I mentioned it to a fisherman I knew, Henry, who occasionally stopped by to drop off fresh cod. When I described the pattern and the piece of wood, his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to notice. "Out past the shoals?" he asked. "Yes." He scratched his beard. "There's wreckage out that way, sure, but none that close. Not anymore. They cleared most of that after the 60s. He hesitated, then added, "You might be seeing the Avery. Folks around here still talk about her." I'd never heard the name. Henry explained that the Margaret Avery was a coastal steamer that went down in 1939, caught in an early winter storm. According to reports, she struck the rocks about 4 miles east of my lighthouse. All hands were lost, but fishermen claimed that, on certain nights, lights could still be seen out there, like someone signaling from the wreck. "Old story," Henry said, almost embarrassed. "Probably just phosphorescence or reflections. But you know how these waters are." I did know. The Maine coast has a weight to it, a silence between waves that makes you feel watched. That night, I stayed up later than usual. The air was unusually still, the sea glass flat. I turned off all the interior lights and stood by the window, letting my eyes adjust. Around 1 a.m., there it was again, 3 short, too long. Fainter this time, but steady. I fetched the binoculars and focused hard on the horizon. And there, for just a second, I saw it. A shadow half-submerged, shaped like the skeleton of a ship. A faint glimmer of light moved along its side, then vanished. The hair on my arms rose. I lowered the binoculars and exhaled slowly. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. I debated taking the dinghy. The distance wasn't far, maybe half a mile. But the tide was changing, and the currents around the shoals could turn lethal without warning. I waited, listened. The light flashed again, then stopped. The next morning, I checked the shoreline. The tide had brought in debris, splinters of wood, rope, seaweed tangled with barnacle-covered metal. Among it all, a small brass plate, green with corrosion. I wiped it clean with my sleeve. The engraving read, Avery. I carried it to the workbench, set it beside the earlier piece of hull, and sat for a long time, staring at both. The rational part of my mind searched for answers. Maybe some salvage operation, maybe debris dragged from the seabed by currents. But the pattern of the lights haunted me. It wasn't random. It felt like communication. Over the following nights, sleep grew harder. I began to hear sounds carried on the wind, faint metallic creaks, like hull plates flexing under strain. Sometimes the foghorn would echo oddly, the sound doubling back as though reflected from something solid out at sea. One evening, while checking the oil tanks, I heard footsteps above me in the lantern room. Slow, deliberate, scraping on the iron grating. When I climbed up, the room was empty. Only the faint hum of the motor and the steady rotation of the lens. I stood there a long time, listening to the wind and the sea far below, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. The following day, I resolved to take the boat. The weather was calm, the sky a dull gray, the air heavy with the scent of salt and kelp. I packed a lantern, rope, compass, and my radio. I left a note in the logbook, investigating possible debris east of shoals. Estimated return 1,400 hours. The rowboat creaked under my weight as I pushed off. The water was cold and smooth as glass, the oars dipping quietly, small rings of silver spreading out with each pull. The lighthouse shrank behind me until it was just a white column against the sky. Halfway out, the wind picked up slightly. The smell of the sea deepened, briny, almost metallic. Gulls circled overhead, crying harshly, then veered inland. I reached the edge of the shoals, where the water changed color from gray-blue to deep green. Then I saw it, dark shapes below the surface, like ribs of something large. I dropped the anchor and leaned over the edge. The wreck was there, unmistakable. The outline of a hull, the bow half buried in sand, seaweed waving in the slow current. And something else, a faint, pulsing glow emanated from within the wreck, steady and rhythmic. 3 short paws too long. I felt my throat tighten. The light came from a point near the stern, deep enough that the details blurred in the water. I tried to convince myself it was bioluminescence, maybe chemical reactions in decaying material. But the pattern was too clean, too exact. I marked the coordinates on my chart, hauled up the anchor, and began rowing back. Halfway to shore, the radio crackled. A faint voice, barely audible under static. "Light, is that you?" I froze, the oars resting in the locks. "This is Lighthouse 7-2, I said, pressing the transmit key. "Identify yourself." Static. Then, "Need help?" The signal cut. I tried again. Nothing. By the time I reached shore, the sky had darkened, clouds rolling in from the east. The sea changed color again, from slate gray to the deep green-black that always came before storms. I secured the boat and climbed the rocks, the wind stiff against my back. The moment I stepped into the tower, the lantern went out. No warning, no flicker, just darkness. I relit it with the emergency wick and checked the wiring. Everything was intact. But when I stepped back, I noticed the beam seemed dimmer, almost absorbed by the air itself. That night, the signal came again, stronger than before, so bright it illuminated the walls of the lighthouse interior with brief flashes. 3 short paws too long. Over and over, I stood at the top of the tower, staring into the darkness. And then, faintly, I heard it. The creak of wood, the sound of a ship rolling in water. But there was no ship, only open sea. The next morning, I phoned the Coast Guard again, gave my coordinates, and requested an inspection. They promised to send a patrol when weather allowed. 2 days passed before they came. Gray cutter on calm seas, 2 officers in slickers. They found nothing. No debris, no signal. When they left, one of them, a younger man with kind eyes, paused at the door. "You've been here alone how long?" "7 months, I said. He nodded slowly. "Isolation plays tricks. Happens to a lot of keepers. Don't take it personal." I didn't argue, but that night, when I climbed to the top of the tower, I found something on the windowsill. A small brass compass, tarnished but intact. The needle was fixed east. I still don't know how it got there. In the weeks that followed, the weather turned. Storm after storm rolled through, heavy rain and wind screaming around the tower. The sea grew violent, hurling spray high enough to rattle the lantern glass. During one of those storms, I heard the signal again, closer now, almost beneath the tower. I leaned out into the rain, blinking against the salt spray, and there it was, light beneath the waves, moving. For one terrible instant, I saw the outline of a ship below the surface. A ghostly hull tilted on its side, ropes trailing like kelp, and along its rail, faint figures standing motionless, facing the lighthouse. Then the lightning struck nearby, blinding me. When I opened my eyes again, the sea was empty. I remember sitting on the floor of the lantern room for a long time afterward, the storm battering the glass. My pulse was calm, steady, not fear, acceptance, as though something had been waiting for me to see. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sea was calm again, the sky clear and brittle blue. I went down to the rocks, drawn by some quiet instinct, and found a piece of brass half buried in sand. When I wiped it clean, the engraving read, "To those who keep the light, so others may find the shore." I don't know how long I stood there, the sun rising behind me, the wind drying the salt on my face. But I remember feeling, for the first time, that I wasn't alone. Not in a haunting sense, but in the quiet realization that every light we tend carries echoes of those who once did the same. It's been years since that night. I left the lighthouse the following spring, when automation replaced the old lens. The building still stands, though the Coast Guard only visits quarterly. Sometimes I drive up along the coast and watch from a distance. And sometimes, on clear nights, I see it, 3 short flashes, too long, low on the horizon. I don't signal back anymore. I just stand there, listening to the wind move through the grass, the distant call of gulls, the faint roar of the Atlantic against the rocks. I think about the rhythm of the light, about the way it seemed to call and answer across time. There are things the sea keeps that no report will ever record. Messages too old for our language, carried in salt and current and the memory of shipwrecks. And I have learned, through long nights and steady storms, that not every signal we receive is meant for rescue. Some are simply reminders that we are not as alone as we think. It started in late October, that gray time between the stubborn last warmth of fall and the first real bite of winter in Michigan. I remember the day clearly because the air had that metallic scent that comes when the cold begins to seep into the city, mingling with the exhaust and damp concrete. The sky was low and overcast, a blanket of dull pewter pressing down on Detroit. I had just unlocked the garage at the corner of Gresham and 9 Mile, an old, brick-walled shop with rust stains running down from the gutters like tears, when I noticed the first symbol IT was etched into the inside of a car frame, a 2010 Dodge Charger that had come in for frame alignment and suspension work. The mark was shallow, no bigger than my thumbprint, and looked almost like someone had tried to scratch a stylized with a circle around it using a screwdriver. It was faint but deliberate. At first, I assumed it was just a factory mark or a bored mechanic's doodle, something from years back. Detroit cars have history baked into their bones. Sometimes you find cigarette burns on seat frames, initials carved beneath dashboards, tiny traces of the people who built or owned them. But this one, it was different. The grooves were too clean, too sharp, as if made recently, and not in a place anyone would normally bother marking. I ran my fingertip over it and felt the cool, fine edge of the metal. The scratch was fresh, I didn't think much of it then. I finished my coffee, let the compressor hum to life, and started on the alignment work. But as I worked through the week, the symbols kept showing up. Not on the same car, but on others. Always in hidden places, beneath door panels, near the inner frame by the rear wheel well, under the chassis crossbeam. Never visible to a casual glance, always requiring disassembly or deep inspection. The marks varied slightly in shape. Some looked like triangles enclosed in loops, others like branching lines, almost runic. And always the same depth, as though carved by a steady, careful hand. At first I chalked it up to coincidence, maybe some batch of cars had been vandalized before resale. But when I found the symbols on a Toyota and a Ford in the same week, both privately owned and unrelated, the thought began to gnaw at me. Detroit at night can make your imagination run wild if you let it. Between the old factories and the miles of empty lots, the air hums with stories that never quite died. I told myself it was just that old city energy, leftover paranoia. Still, I started paying attention. One evening, around 7 p.m., the sun had already sunk behind the skyline. The shop smelled like oil and wet cement, and the halogen lights buzzed faintly. I was alone, finishing up the brake job on a Chevy Silverado. The air outside was misty, fog creeping low along the street, blurring the edges of the neighborhood. I had just lowered the truck from the lift when I saw something catch the light. There, along the inner lip of the rear wheel well, was another symbol. This one was different, not just scratched, but burned in. A fine, black ring, maybe made with a soldering iron that I remember feeling my stomach tighten, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of cold awareness. Someone had taken the time to mark these, and that meant someone was out there doing it systematically. The next morning, I mentioned it to Earl, the shop's owner. He was an old hand, been working cars since the 70s, always smelled like cigarettes and motor oil. He gave me a half-listening shrug. "People do weird crap, man," he said. "We once found a whole set of tarot cards in a trunk welded shut. Probably just some nut with too much time. Maybe, but it didn't feel like that. The marks were too uniform, too purposeful." A few days later, a customer came in with a Jeep that had been sitting for years in a storage garage near the outskirts of the city. "Somewhere near the old Packard plant," he said. "The frame was rusted, the undercarriage nearly eaten away by time, and the whole thing smelled faintly of mold and dust." As I pulled off the wheel housing, I saw not one symbol, but three. They were arranged in a triangle, each line etched clean through the rust, exposing bright silver underneath. I leaned in closer and felt the rough edges with my fingertip. The metal was cold, but I could feel the faintest warmth in the marks themselves, as though they had been burned or cut with something hot not too long ago. That's when I began to keep notes. I bought a small notebook and started sketching each symbol I found. Their shapes, the make and model of the car, the position on the frame, even the weather that day. There were 15 by mid-November. The pattern wasn't random, though I couldn't make sense of it. The marks seemed to appear more often on vehicles that had been off the road for a while, or ones that had been in accidents and towed from remote areas. It was around that time I started having trouble sleeping. I'd find myself waking up at 3 a.m., heart racing, feeling like someone had just whispered my name. No noise, no movement, just the stillness of the house pressing against my skin. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to trace one of the cars back to its previous owner. A silver Subaru Forester had come in for frame reinforcement. The symbol had been on the undercarriage near the exhaust mount. The owner, a woman named Karen, had bought it used from a lot outside the city. She said the car had originally been found abandoned in a small forested area near Brighton, west of Detroit. She didn't know much else. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I took my old Ford Ranger, packed a flashlight, thermos, and my notebook, and drove out toward Brighton after dusk. The air had that sharp, electric chill, maybe 35 degrees, and the smell of fallen leaves was strong enough to taste. The forest there isn't deep, more a patchwork of thin woods, old trails, and half-forgotten dirt roads that used to serve hunting cabins. I parked at the edge of a clearing and walked in, boots crunching on damp leaves. The moon was a dull smear behind fast-moving clouds. I moved slowly, sweeping the beam of my flashlight along the ground, over trees, along the remnants of an old fence line. That's when I saw it, the faint impression of tire tracks in the dirt, half filled with rainwater, leading deeper into the woods. I followed. About 50 yards in, the air changed. It's hard to explain, but the forest seemed to grow still. Even the wind softened, as though I'd stepped into some forgotten pocket of time. The smell of wet bark filled my nose, rich and earthy. Then, at the base of a birch tree, I saw the glint of metal. A small piece of car frame, maybe from a bumper or undercarriage, lay half buried in the soil, rusted and cracked. I crouched down, brushed away the dirt, and saw it. The same circular symbol etched clean through the rust. The same lines, the same precise angles. I remember standing there for a long while, my breath fogging in front of me. I wasn't scared yet, more curious than anything, but I had that instinctive prickling between the shoulder blades, the kind that says someone's watching. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The forest was still, except for the slow drip of condensation from the trees. That was when I heard it. A faint metallic click, like the sound of a wrench slipping on a bolt, came from somewhere to my left, maybe 30 feet away. I froze, held my breath, and waited. The noise didn't come again, but I caught the faintest smell of something. Not quite smoke, not quite oil. More like hot metal cooling. I didn't call out. Instead, I backed away slowly, counting my steps, keeping the beam of the flashlight low. By the time I reached the truck, my palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. Back at home, I couldn't shake it. I cleaned the dirt off the metal scrap and compared the marking to my sketches. Identical. Whoever made these marks was working with some kind of consistent design, maybe even a purpose. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. A couple of cars came in that had similar marks, but they weren't just symbols this time. One had faint burn patterns radiating outward, almost like heat rings. Another had the symbol etched near a small, circular indentation that looked like it had been pressed with something round and hot. Maybe a branding tool that I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence. Maybe some bizarre local trend or even a mechanic signature I hadn't heard about. Still, I began checking the security cameras at the shop every night. One evening in mid-December, around 10:30, I sat in the office reviewing the footage. The shop was dark except for the glow of the monitor. The heater rattled occasionally in the background. Most nights were uneventful. Cars sitting still under the harsh light, the motion sensor occasionally triggered by a passing cat. But then, around 2:17 a.m., I saw it. A shape moved through the shop. Not walking, but gliding with a kind of stiff, deliberate motion. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like coveralls and gloves. It went straight to the Chevy I'd worked on earlier that day, crouched by the rear, and stayed there for about 30 seconds. Then it stood, moved to another car, repeated the motion, and left. No hesitation, no wasted movement. The next morning, I checked those two cars. Both had fresh symbols. The logical part of my mind tried to piece it together. Maybe someone was breaking in, maybe this was some urban ritual or prank. But the more I thought about it, the less it fit. Why break into a closed garage just to carve small, hidden marks into cars? I decided to follow the signs. The next time I found a symbol, I traced the car's history again. It had been towed from an area near the Huron National Forest, about 2 hours north. A stretch of quiet wilderness, thousands of acres of pine and birch, lakes like glass, and the occasional whisper of an old logging road. I called the tow company. The dispatcher said the vehicle had been found on an overgrown trail near a decommissioned ranger station. That weekend, I drove up there. The trip took me through gray farmland, then long corridors of leafless trees. The sky was the color of pewter again, the same tone as the day I first saw the mark. The air smelled faintly of snow. By the time I reached the forest edge, dusk was falling. I parked at a small gravel turnout and started down the old ranger road. The dirt was frozen solid, the air sharp enough to sting my nose. My breath came out in soft plumes. The trail was lined with pine needles and patches of frost, and I could hear the slow creak of branches overhead. After maybe half a mile, I came to a clearing. There, half collapsed under a tangle of vines, stood the remnants of a wooden outbuilding, maybe an old garage or tool shed. The air around it felt strangely still. No birds, no rustling, just silence. Inside, I found car parts, dozens of them. Frames, panels, engines, all rusted and stacked in rough piles. Some looked decades old, others surprisingly recent. And on nearly every piece, somewhere in the metal, was a symbol. I felt a chill spread through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I crouched beside one of the frames and ran my hand along the lines of the etching. The grooves were too perfect to be done by hand, laser smooth, precise. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, crunching the frost-covered ground. I turned. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, wrapped in a dark coat, the face hidden beneath a hood. They didn't move, didn't speak. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling slightly in my grip. For a few long seconds, we just stood there, the only sound the faint hiss of wind through the pines. Then, without a word, the figure turned and walked away into the trees. I followed at a distance, every step muffled by the frost. They moved with an eerie calm, like they knew exactly where they were going. After maybe 5 minutes, the trees opened into another clearing. At the center stood a car, or what was left of one. Stripped down to its frame, the metal gleaming faintly under the moonlight. The figure stopped beside it, knelt, and placed a gloved hand on the steel. Then I saw it, the faint glow. The symbol on the car's frame pulsed, just once, a dull orange shimmer like heated metal cooling. I don't remember making the decision to leave. I just turned and ran. Not fast, not in panic, just steady, controlled. The way your body moves when your instincts take the wheel. I kept the trail in sight, retraced my steps to the truck, and didn't stop until I saw the glow of the dashboard lights. When I looked back toward the woods, everything was still. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the marks have stopped appearing in the cars I work on. The nights are quieter, the dreams less vivid. But every so often, I catch myself looking at the underside of a chassis a little too long, my fingers brushing along the metal as if searching for something. I still have that notebook. Sometimes, when the shop is empty and the rain hammers against the tin roof, I flip through it. Through the sketches, the notes, the little maps I made of where each symbol was found. They form a kind of pattern, like a web stretching outward from the city toward the woods. I've come to believe it wasn't random. Those marks were a kind of message, maybe a record, maybe a warning. I don't know, but I do know this: metal remembers. Every car carries traces of where it's been, what it's seen, what it's endured. Maybe those symbols were just another way of marking that history, by someone or something that understands what's buried in steel better than we do. Now, when I walk through the shop late at night, I sometimes catch the faint scent of hot metal, that same sharp tang I noticed in the forest. It fades quickly, gone before I can trace it. I've learned to take it as a reminder. Not everything made by human hands stays entirely human. And sometimes, the stories that live in steel have their own ways of being told. Quiet, deliberate, etched deep enough that time itself won't wear them away. So I keep listening. Every hum of the compressor, every rattle of the lift, every flicker of light on the frame of a car that's seen too much road. Because somewhere in all that metal and motion, I think there's still something whispering, not words, but a feeling, a pulse. The same one that started it all. And though I'll never fully understand it, I've made peace with it. These days, when the first snow of winter dusts the shop windows and the air tastes like iron and cold, I find myself stepping outside, watching the city breathe beneath the clouds. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the lights, the forest waits, silent, patient, keeping its own record in the bones of abandoned machines. I've learned not to go looking for it again, but I know, deep down, that if I ever did, the marks would still be there, carved clean and bright, waiting under the skin of the world, reminding me that even in steel, there are things alive enough to remember who touched them last.